What's up, family? It's your boy. Um, so basically, as everybody knows, I'm going through flight school again to be an instructor. Most of it is describing things and why, which is hard because until this point, never had to put too much thought into that. Anyway, I'm gonna start this series on here, perhaps, of kind of very basic beginner stuff I would be teaching a student pilot. So I posted something on Instagram for people to ask non-aviation people to ask me stuff about flying and whatnot because realistically those are questions that student pilots will ask you. So one of the ones that showed up a couple of times was, how's an airplane fly? Right? Uh, all of humanity has kind of dreamed of actually flying, and it wasn't until just over 100 something years ago that we finally figured out how to do it, which in the span of time is really relatively short. So, let's dive in. So, the thing about how an airplane flies is that, according to the FAA, there are a few different theories. Flight is all theory. There's no factual thing. There's no one factual thing that makes an airplane fly, but we have a pretty good understanding of it, obviously. The one I like to go with is the Bernoulli principle, which was so Daniel Bernoulli was a Swiss mathematician and physicist back in the 1700s. He did a bunch of math stuff, but what we get for flight out of what he did in his lifetime was the Venturi effect. So let's take a closer look into that. So this is a basic Venturi. It's basically something where an air or liquid goes in and out of one side with a squeezed middle part. And basically what that does is create a low pressure system through this middle part as opposed to high pressure on the beginning and end. So what does this have to do with flying? Well, let's take a closer look here. So if we erase one half of the Venturi and draw a line on the bottom, this is a basic wing foil. So now, running into the wind, you got high pressure on the low side of the wing and low pressure on the upper side of the wing. And basically what happens is high pressure wants to go to low pressure. It wants to even out. You think about when you were a kid or now, cruising down the highway with your hand out the window. If you keep it perfectly straight, it still wants to go up, right? Why is that? Because the high pressure air on the bottom of your hand is trying to equalize the low pressure air above. And basically what it does is creates kind of a suction type thing where, again, the high pressure tries to equalize the low pressure, so therefore it lifts the wing. Now we're going to get into the four forces of flight that make an aircraft stay flying. Okay, so we figured out how we get our lift, which is one of the four factors of flying. The other three are going to be thrust, weight, and drag. So basically the way we get off the ground is this idea, and we want thrust. The faster the airspeed, the more differential of pressure there is until we're finally able to lift off the ground with enough power. As we're flying, we have to basically every action has an equal and opposite reaction, Newton's third law, right? So as we have our weight, which is the aircraft itself, gravity is also trying to pull us down. In order to fly, we have to overcome that with lift. Thrust power, every plane's gonna get that with the engines, right? We get drag through our secondary flight controls primarily. There's a couple different kinds of drag. The two to really know are induced drag, which is the result of thrust, and parasite drag, which is due to the shapes and whatnot of the aircraft. So ideally, when you're flying, these are all perfectly in balance. That's what makes something fly. If any of these are not in balance, you're not flying. Even when you're climbing, descending, turning, they're all equal. It's just that momentary movement of pitching up or pitching down, it'll become unequalized. But in order to sustain flight, all of these are equal. So how do we control ourselves once we're in the air? Because if we were to just throw something fast enough, like a piece of wood or styrofoam, it'll get airborne. But how do we control it once it's there? Let's take a look. Otherwise, there's no point in doing that, and we're just probably going to end up crashing. So there's essentially 3 axes that run through the aircraft, and our primary flight control surfaces dictate the movement about those axes. So we'll kind of use this here 777X for example. So there's going to be an axis running down the body of the aircraft. This is the longitudinal axis. How we move about the longitudinal axis is the flight control known as ailerons. If you look close enough here, it's these really tiny control surfaces at the very end of the wing. We'll get to all these guys later. So basically what the ailerons do is control your movement along the longitudinal axis. This is called a roll, by the way. When you go left to right like this, you're rolling. Then we have our vertical axis, which stands up, basically goes through the plane like straight up. And how we move about on the vertical axis is the rudder, which is this guy on the back here. And what this does is it controls us left to right exactly. And this is called yawing with the rudder. And then, last but not least, we got our lateral axis, which runs through the wings, ideally. And what we got to control that is these guys on the back, on here. These are called elevators. And they what call pitch us up and down. And so a combination of all 3 of those, you're able to turn, climb, descend, everything. And that's the essentials for sure, which is why they're primary flight controls. And then we got our secondary flight controls. So all of these secondary flight controls are creating drag, which are slowing us down because that's the opposite of thrust. And bigger airplanes need more secondary flight controls because they go faster and they're harder to slow down. On a transport category aircraft such as this bad boy, we got a lot of secondary flight controls. All of these So these guys in the back here are flaps. Basically, you'll see them when you're landing. All of these guys are called spoilers. It's the big part of the wing that comes out and looks all scary like a Terminator. And again, you see these on landing. It's the top part of the wing that flops up, basically. And again, its purpose is to slow down the aircraft. It's basically reshaping the wing so that it's not as aerodynamically efficient as it is in flight. And then we got these front ones. These are called slats. And those are basically flaps just in the front. You'll see them come down too. You're not going to be able to see a trim tab on a jet like such, but you would on a little general aviation aircraft. But basically, a trim tab is they're usually on the elevators. They can be on the rudders, but it's basically, it kind of would look like another flap. It's just like a smaller part of this. So basically, the faster you go, the more pressure you have to use on the controls because the speed is increasing, right? And so what the trim tab does is kind of redirect the air over the control surfaces, and you're able to relax on the controls and get it to pretty much fly itself, as opposed to having to hold it back the whole time or push it forward the whole time. It'll aerodynamically do that for you. So that is how an airplane flies. Let me know what you think, what I could have expanded on, what I went too in depth in. If you learned something, all right, cool, thanks, bye.